Ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you something fundamental, something undeniable about the nature of cruelty. It does not simply dissipate into the ether. It lingers, it festers, it grows roots in the mind of the perpetrator, and if left unchecked, it destroys them from within. You see, people believe they can act with impunity, that their deceit, their malice, their petty attempts to diminish others will go unnoticed, will be forgotten. But that's not how the world works. That's not how the psyche works. Every unjust action, every moment of cruelty is an act of self-betrayal. And self-betrayal is no small thing. It accumulates like poison in the soul. Cruelty is not just an action, it is a force, a pattern of behavior that leaves deep psychological and societal scars. Many people assume that their acts of malevolence, whether great or small, will simply dissipate over time, forgotten by others, erased from their own conscience. But this is a dangerous illusion. The consequences of cruelty do not just disappear, they reverberate through time, affecting both the victim and the perpetrator in profound ways. The world operates on a balance of order and chaos, and acts of cruelty, deliberate or even negligent, tip the scales toward destruction. But what so many fail to realize is that this destruction does not remain external. It turns inward. It poisons the mind, corrupts the soul, and erodes the stability of the individual who engages in it. At its core, cruelty is a violation of moral and psychological order. Every human being carries within them an inherent sense of right and wrong, even if it is buried under layers of justification or denial. This is why, when someone commits an act of cruelty, whether through deceit, humiliation, exploitation, or outright violence, there is always an internal price to pay. A lie requires another lie to sustain itself. An act of harm requires justification to avoid guilt. Over time, this creates a psychological burden that becomes harder to carry. And the more cruelty one engages in, the heavier this burden becomes. One of the most insidious aspects of cruelty is its tendency to snowball. A person who lies once to manipulate a situation might find it easy at first, but over time, they become ensnared in their own web of deception. The mind cannot compartmentalize evil forever. It seeps into every corner, every thought, every interaction. The liar becomes paranoid, the betrayer becomes anxious, and the abuser begins to fear retribution. The weight of cruelty compounds, leading not to power or security, but to a gradual erosion of self-trust and personal integrity. History is filled with examples of figures who built their lives on cruelty, only to find themselves haunted by the very forces they unleashed. Tyrants who ruled with an iron fist eventually became prisoners of their own paranoia, fearing betrayal at every turn. Criminals who manipulated and harmed others often descended into madness, unable to escape the guilt that gnawed at their subconscious. Even in everyday life, the person who bullies, cheats, or manipulates others is rarely at peace. They may project confidence, but deep down, they know that their actions have consequences that cannot be avoided forever. The mind is not designed to endure sustained cruelty without consequence. There is a psychological price to pay for every action that violates the fundamental principles of decency and truth. People who engage in cruelty often suffer from chronic stress, anxiety, and even physical illness, as their nervous system responds to the ongoing tension of maintaining a false or malevolent reality. The guilt, even if denied on a conscious level, manifests in sleepless nights, self-destructive habits, and a relentless sense of unease. They may try to distract themselves with material success, shallow pleasures, or empty validation, but none of it truly silences the voice within that whispers the truth. You are not who you pretend to be. Beyond the individual level, cruelty has a corrosive effect on society itself. When acts of malevolence go unchecked, they create a culture of fear and distrust. Institutions become corrupt, relationships become fragile, and entire communities begin to disintegrate. But as with individuals, society cannot sustain cruelty indefinitely. Sooner or later, systems that are built on oppression collapse under their own weight, whether in governments, businesses, or personal relationships. The long-term consequences of cruelty always lead to instability, because cruelty breeds resentment, and resentment fuels destruction. The ultimate tragedy is that those who engage in cruelty often believe they are gaining something, power, status, control, but in reality, they are sowing the seeds of their own downfall. The strongest individuals are not those who dominate others through force or deception, but those who possess the courage to act with integrity even in the face of adversity. A person who builds their life on truth may struggle in the short term, but they will not be haunted by the ghosts of their own actions. They will not lie awake at night wondering when the consequences of their deceit will catch up to them. They will not need to construct elaborate mental defenses to justify their wrongdoing. To avoid the haunting consequences of cruelty, one must make a conscious effort to choose the path of truth and responsibility. This is not easy. It requires vigilance, self-awareness, and the willingness to confront one's own flaws. It means resisting the temptation to manipulate, exploit, or harm others for personal gain. It means understanding that every action, no matter how small, contributes to the shaping of one's character. And ultimately, it means realizing that cruelty is never truly free. It always carries a cost, and those who engage in it will, sooner or later, come to understand that their cruelty does not just affect the world around them, it shapes who they become. And who they become may very well be their own worst nightmare. Every individual is faced with a fundamental choice: to act in a manner that upholds moral responsibility or to surrender to the temptation of cruelty and chaos. This choice is not trivial. It defines the structure of one's life, the stability of one's mind, and the integrity of the society in which one exists. Human beings are not mere animals, instinct-driven and without moral consideration. We are creatures capable of self-reflection, creatures who bear the burden of ethical responsibility. This is both a privilege and a weight. It means that each person is accountable for their actions, not only in the eyes of others, but more importantly, in the eyes of their own conscience. And conscience is not something that can be tricked, ignored, or suppressed without consequence. Cruelty, in all its forms, is a rejection of responsibility. It is the willingness to disregard the suffering of others for personal gain, amusement, or power. The moment an individual chooses cruelty over compassion, they are making a statement about their values. They are aligning themselves with forces of destruction rather than creation, with chaos rather than order. And once this pattern of behavior is established, it is difficult to break. It is far easier to destroy than to build, to deceive than to tell the truth, to exploit than to uplift. But the ease of cruelty is deceptive because it comes at a cost that is often not immediately apparent. The person who lies to gain an advantage believes they have won something. The person who manipulates others into submission believes they have asserted dominance. The person who belittles and humiliates others believes they have established superiority. But this is an illusion. No one who engages in such acts escapes unscathed. The mind keeps a record of every betrayal, every deception, every act of harm, and the weight of that record grows heavier over time. This is why individuals who live without integrity often find themselves consumed by anxiety, paranoia, and self-loathing. They may project confidence, but inside, they know they are standing on unstable ground. To reject cruelty and take responsibility for one's actions requires immense courage. It means acknowledging one's capacity for harm and actively choosing to restrain it. It means understanding that strength is not measured by how much one can dominate others, but by how much one can control oneself. There is a dangerous misconception in the modern world that power is derived from force, manipulation, and intimidation. But true power, real sustainable power, comes from self-mastery. It comes from the ability to act with integrity even when dishonesty would be easier. It comes from the willingness to bear responsibility even when avoiding it would be more convenient. There is a reason why the great thinkers of history, from religious leaders to philosophers to psychologists, have emphasized the importance of moral responsibility. Without it, there is no stability, neither within the individual nor within society. When people refuse to take responsibility for their actions, they create a world in which suffering multiplies. They rationalize their cruelty, they justify their wrongdoing, they blame others for their misdeeds. But deep down, they know they are deceiving themselves, and this self-deception leads to a form of psychological torment that no amount of external success can alleviate. A society that encourages individuals to abandon moral responsibility is a society doomed to collapse. History has shown this time and time again. When people no longer feel accountable for their actions, when cruelty becomes normalized, when dishonesty is rewarded, the entire foundation of civilization begins to erode. Trust disappears. Institutions become corrupt. Relationships deteriorate. And in the end, those who thought they could escape the consequences of their actions find themselves trapped in the very destruction they helped create. Personal responsibility is not just a virtue, it is a necessity. It is the only safeguard against the chaos that inevitably follows when people act without conscience. It is the foundation of a meaningful life, a life in which one can stand tall and say, I have not betrayed myself. I have not surrendered to the temptation of cruelty. I have faced the difficult path of truth and integrity, and I have walked it with honor. But this is not an easy path. It requires constant vigilance. It requires an honest assessment of one's own actions, a willingness to admit fault, and the discipline to correct course when one strays. It requires the courage to stand against injustice, even when it is inconvenient or dangerous to do so. It requires the strength to resist the impulse for revenge, the temptation of easy gain at another's expense, the desire to control rather than to lead. Many people avoid this path because it demands too much. It is far simpler to go along with the crowd, to justify small acts of cruelty as insignificant, to pretend that personal actions do not matter in the grand scheme of things. But this is a lie. Every action matters. Every decision shapes the kind of person one becomes. And ultimately, one must live with the consequences of those choices. When an individual refuses to take responsibility, when they engage in cruelty and justify it as necessary or inconsequential, they are setting themselves up for a reckoning. It may not come immediately, but it will come, because the world operates on a moral structure that cannot be ignored. Actions have consequences, and those who believe they can escape their own wrongdoing are deluding themselves. The alternative, the path of responsibility, truth, and integrity, is not easy, but it is the only path that leads to genuine strength and stability. It is the only path that allows an individual to look in the mirror without shame, to sleep at night without fear, to build a life that is not haunted by the weight of cruelty. It is the path of true power, because it is the path that aligns the individual with order, meaning, and the highest potential of human nature. And that is the only way to live without regret. The human psyche is not a blank slate, nor is it a machine that can function without consequence regardless of input. It is a finely tuned, deeply complex system that responds to every action, every thought, and every moral decision a person makes. When someone engages in cruelty, whether through lies, betrayal, manipulation, or outright violence, they may believe that these actions exist in isolation, affecting only their victims, but that is not how the human mind works. Acts of cruelty are not merely external events, they are internalized, woven into the fabric of a person's psychological being. Over time, they shape one's character, alter perception, and create a burden that cannot be easily shaken off. A person who deceives others deceives themselves first. To justify cruelty, one must engage in a series of mental gymnastics, bending reality, distorting truth, and silencing the voice of conscience. At first, this may seem manageable. The mind is remarkably adept at rationalizing wrongdoing, at providing excuses that make it easier to live with one's actions. But deep down, beneath all the layers of justification, the truth remains. And truth, no matter how much one tries to suppress it, has a way of making itself known. The psychological burden of cruelty manifests in many ways. Guilt, even when ignored, lingers beneath the surface. It gnaws at the edges of thought, surfacing in moments of stillness, in dreams, in the quiet moments when distraction is no longer possible. People who engage in cruelty often find themselves plagued by anxiety, restlessness, and an unshakable sense of unease. They may not consciously connect these feelings to their actions, but the connection exists nonetheless. The mind keeps a record of every betrayal, every moment of malice, and the weight of that record accumulates. One of the most destructive aspects of cruelty is the way it erodes self-trust. When a person lies, manipulates, or harms others, they begin to lose confidence in their own integrity. This is not a superficial loss. It is a foundational one. Self-trust is essential for a stable and meaningful life. It allows a person to move forward with certainty, to make decisions without constant self-doubt, to stand firm in the face of adversity. But when someone engages in cruelty, they create a rift within themselves. They become two people, the one they present to the world and the one they know themselves to be. This division leads to inner conflict, to a state of cognitive dissonance that is both exhausting and destructive. The more a person engages in cruelty, the more they must suppress their own awareness of it. This suppression takes energy. It requires distraction, constant stimulation, and often self-destructive habits. Many people who engage in prolonged cruelty turn to substance abuse, reckless behavior, or other forms of escapism in an attempt to silence their own minds. But no amount of external distraction can erase the internal consequences of malevolence. The guilt remains, buried but not eliminated, waiting for moments of vulnerability to rise to the surface. Cruelty also leads to paranoia. A person who lies constantly begins to assume that others are lying to them. A person who betrays others starts to fear betrayal at every turn. This is because the mind projects outward what it harbors within. If someone builds their world on deception, they will see deception everywhere. If they build it on violence, they will expect violence in return. This creates a cycle of mistrust and fear, one that isolates the individual and makes genuine connection with others increasingly difficult. The long-term psychological toll of cruelty can be severe. Chronic stress, anxiety, depression, these are common consequences for those who engage in sustained malevolence. The body responds to internal conflict as it does to external threats, activating stress responses that over time take a physical toll. High blood pressure, weakened immune function, sleep disturbances. These are not just random ailments. They are often the body's reaction to an unresolved psychological burden. The mind and body are deeply interconnected, and what affects one inevitably affects the other. Beyond the individual, cruelty creates ripple effects that extend into relationships, communities, and even entire societies. A person who consistently acts with malice or dishonesty poisons the environments they inhabit. They create instability, erode trust, and spread suffering far beyond themselves. And yet, the most tragic aspect of all is that they too suffer. They may not admit it, may not even fully realize it, but their actions trap them in a prison of their own making. The walls of that prison are built from every lie, every betrayal, every moment of harm they have inflicted. And as those walls close in, they find themselves alone, disconnected, haunted by the consequences of their own choices. But this fate is not inevitable. The burden of cruelty can be avoided and even undone through the difficult but necessary work of truth and responsibility. A person who acknowledges their wrongdoing, who takes responsibility for their actions, who strives to make amends, begins the process of freeing themselves from the weight of their own past. This is not an easy path. It requires humility, courage, and an unwavering commitment to self-awareness. And it requires confronting the darker parts of oneself, facing the reality of past actions, and making a conscious choice to change. The truth is that no one is beyond redemption, but redemption is not automatic. It is earned through effort, through discipline, through the daily choice to reject cruelty and embrace integrity. A person who chooses this path will find that over time, the weight they have carried begins to lighten. They will find that the paranoia, the guilt, the self-doubt, these begin to fade as they align themselves with truth rather than deception. And in doing so, they will not only free themselves, but they will also contribute to a world that is less burdened by suffering, less dominated by malevolence, and more grounded in the values that sustain human life at its highest potential. The choice is always there to act with cruelty or with kindness, to deceive or to tell the truth, to betray or to uphold integrity. And while the path of cruelty may seem easier in the moment, it is a path that leads only to suffering, both for others and for oneself. Those who choose it will, in the end, find themselves haunted by the very actions they thought would bring them power. And that is the great irony. That cruelty, which appears to offer strength, ultimately leads to weakness, isolation, and self-destruction. There is a deeply ingrained belief among those who engage in cruelty that their actions will simply dissolve with time, that the past will remain the past, and that they can continue forward without consequence. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the way human nature operates. Cruelty is not just an event that occurs and disappears. It is an action that embeds itself into the very structure of reality. It lingers, reverberates, and most critically, it demands retribution, if not from external forces, then from within the mind of the perpetrator. There is no such thing as an action without consequence. Every choice made, every act committed leaves a trace, and those who believe they can escape their own past are deceiving themselves. The world has a way of settling moral debts, often in ways that are unexpected and unavoidable. Those who act with cruelty, who manipulate, who betray, and who inflict harm upon others, set into motion a chain of events that extends beyond their immediate awareness. They may think they have gained an advantage, secured a victory, or demonstrated power over another, but in doing so, they plant a seed, one that will grow, fester, and return to them in a form they are unprepared to handle. This is not mystical or supernatural. It is psychological, social, and deeply embedded in the natural laws that govern human interaction. One of the most immediate ways in which cruelty returns to haunt the perpetrator is through the disintegration of trust. Trust is not merely a social convenience. It is the foundation upon which meaningful relationships, institutions, and societies are built. The moment a person engages in cruelty, they compromise this foundation. They send a message to those around them that they are not to be trusted, that their words and actions do not align, that they are willing to cause harm if it serves their own interests. This has consequences. People may not always retaliate openly, but they remember. They withdraw, they calculate their own protections, and crucially, they wait. The world is not as simple as those who act with malice believe it to be. It is not a structure that allows individuals to endlessly manipulate without repercussions. Human beings are remarkably perceptive, even when they do not immediately act on what they see. Those who engage in cruelty assume that because they have not been confronted, they are free from consequence. But this is not true. There is a cumulative effect to mistreatment, a slow but inevitable buildup of resentment, distrust, and eventually a desire for retribution. People do not forget those who have wronged them. They may remain silent, they may endure, but in time they find ways to balance the scales. Even in cases where external consequences do not immediately manifest, the internal toll is unavoidable. The mind is not designed to exist in a state of constant deception, manipulation, or malice without suffering. People who act cruelly often believe they are gaining something: control, power, dominance. But in reality, they are losing something far greater, their own peace of mind. The psychological cost of cruelty is profound. It breeds paranoia, as those who engage in it must constantly look over their shoulder, wondering when their actions will come back to them. It breeds insecurity because they know deep down that their victories are built on a foundation of lies and harm rather than true strength. The weight of cruelty does not simply vanish. It accumulates. It burrows deep into the subconscious, manifesting as stress, anxiety, and an ever-present sense of unease. Those who harm others must constantly justify their actions to themselves, creating an internal dialogue that requires endless maintenance. They must tell themselves they were right, that their victims deserved it, that they had no other choice. But the mind is not easily fooled. The more they attempt to suppress the truth, the more it seeps through the cracks in the form of self-doubt, self-loathing, and a gradual erosion of their sense of self. And then there is the element of time. Cruelty may seem like a source of power in the short term, but time has a way of eroding its effectiveness. Those who act with malice often find that their influence diminishes over the years. The people they have wronged do not remain weak forever. Circumstances change. The abused become stronger, more resilient, more aware, and the cruel, believing themselves invincible, grow complacent. They assume their past will never catch up to them, that they have outrun the consequences of their actions. But time is relentless. It reveals truths. It restores balance. And those who once wielded cruelty as a weapon often find themselves alone, abandoned by those they once manipulated, surrounded not by respect or admiration, but by a deep and unshakable resentment. The reality is that no one escapes cruelty unscathed. It is not a tool that can be used without cost. It changes the person who employs it, corrupting their character, distorting their perception, and ultimately leading them to a place of isolation and suffering. Those who embrace cruelty may believe they are securing their future, but in truth, they are undermining it. They are ensuring that their own actions will return to them in a form they cannot control, in a way they cannot anticipate, and at a time when they are least prepared to face it. There is a reason why history is filled with stories of once powerful individuals meeting tragic ends. The tyrants, the manipulators, the deceivers. They rise, but they do not remain. Their cruelty does not fade into history unnoticed. It lingers, shaping the perception of those around them, influencing the actions of those they have wronged, creating an inevitable reckoning that, when it arrives, is often far worse than they could have imagined. And so the lesson is clear. Cruelty does not grant immunity from consequence. It does not provide lasting power, security, or control. It is a temporary illusion, one that eventually collapses under the weight of its own deception. Those who engage in it will, in time, find themselves haunted, not just by the people they have harmed, but by their own choices, by the inescapable realization that they have sown the seeds of their own downfall. There is a profound and inescapable reality that governs human behavior. No one who engages in cruelty, deception, or malevolence will go untouched by the consequences of their actions. This is not merely a moral assertion, it is a psychological, social, and existential truth. The structure of reality is such that every action has a consequence, every decision leaves an imprint, and no one, no matter how powerful or cunning, can indefinitely evade the repercussions of their choices. Those who act with malice often believe they are immune, that their cruelty will go unnoticed, that they can outrun the debts they have accumulated through their actions. But this belief is a delusion. The reckoning comes, if not from external forces, then from within. At the psychological level, the cost of cruelty is immense. The human mind is not built to sustain endless deception and harm without suffering. A person who habitually engages in cruelty must develop mechanisms to justify their behavior, to rationalize their actions, and to silence their conscience. This requires an ongoing war within the self, a battle between what they know to be true and what they must convince themselves of in order to function. But the mind resists such distortions of reality. The more someone attempts to suppress their guilt, the more it finds its way to the surface through anxiety, paranoia, self-doubt, and a creeping sense of unease that never truly disappears. The effects of cruelty are not limited to the individual. They spread outward, shaping relationships and environments in ways that inevitably turn against the perpetrator. A person who mistreats others creates enemies, even if those enemies remain silent for a time. People remember who has wronged them. They may not act immediately, but they do not forget. Trust is broken, respect is eroded, and eventually the social foundation upon which the cruel individual stands begins to crumble. Those who wield manipulation and deception as tools of power often find that in the long run they become isolated, distrusted, and ultimately powerless. Time plays a crucial role in the return of consequences. A person may act with impunity for years, even decades, believing they have escaped accountability. But reality is structured in such a way that deception cannot endure indefinitely. The truth emerges, sometimes in unexpected ways, sometimes through a slow accumulation of small moments that, over time, expose the full weight of past actions. Those who have built their lives on lies, betrayal, and manipulation often find that their past catches up to them when they are least prepared to face it. The advantage they once held disappears, and they are left vulnerable to the consequences they worked so hard to avoid. There is also the element of self-perception. A person who engages in cruelty does not merely harm others, they also reshape their own identity. Every action taken reinforces a way of being. A person who repeatedly chooses deception becomes a liar. A person who repeatedly chooses betrayal becomes untrustworthy. These are not just external labels. They become ingrained in the person's own self-concept. Over time, they begin to see themselves in the light of their own actions, and this realization is often devastating. The more one engages in cruelty, the further they move from the possibility of redemption, not because redemption is impossible, but because they have convinced themselves they are beyond it. Moreover, the consequences of cruelty extend beyond the individual and into the very fabric of society. A society that tolerates cruelty, that rewards deception, that turns a blind eye to malevolence, inevitably begins to deteriorate. Institutions lose their legitimacy, relationships become transactional, and trust, the foundation of all social structures, erodes. And when trust collapses, chaos follows. History provides countless examples of civilizations that fell not because of external threats, but because they allowed corruption, cruelty, and dishonesty to flourish unchecked. Those who believe they can contribute to such decay without being personally affected are gravely mistaken. No one escapes the collapse of the world they help create. Perhaps the most significant consequence of cruelty is the existential suffering it brings. Beyond the psychological and social toll, there is a deeper, more fundamental cost: the loss of meaning. Human beings are not merely biological organisms driven by instinct. We are creatures of meaning, deeply dependent on a sense of purpose, direction, and moral integrity. A person who engages in cruelty must sacrifice meaning in exchange for power, control, or personal gain. But power without meaning is hollow, control without integrity is empty, and personal gain achieved through the suffering of others is a form of self-destruction disguised as success. When a person looks back on their life, what will they see? Will they see a life built on truth, responsibility, and moral courage? Or will they see a series of betrayals, a pattern of deception, a legacy of harm that in the end brought them nothing of real value? This is the ultimate reckoning, the moment when one must confront what they have truly become. And in that moment, the weight of cruelty is inescapable. There is, however, an alternative. The consequences of past cruelty are severe, but they are not necessarily permanent. A person who acknowledges their wrongdoing, who takes responsibility, who seeks to make amends, begins the process of redemption. This is not an easy path. It requires humility, it requires effort, and most of all, it requires an honest confrontation with oneself. but it is the only path that leads away from suffering. It is the only path that restores meaning. Reality is structured in such a way that cruelty cannot go unanswered, whether through the consequences imposed by society, the suffering inflicted by one's own mind, or the inevitable reckoning of time. Those who engage in cruelty will face their actions. No one escapes. No one outruns the past forever. The question is not whether justice will be served, but when, and whether, when that moment arrives, the individual will be prepared to face. Cruelty is not a path to power, nor is it a means to lasting success. It is a self-destructive force that erodes the mind, poisons relationships, and reshapes the very character of the person who wields it. No one who engages in deception, betrayal, or malice escapes unscathed. The consequences may not be immediate, but they are inevitable. The human psyche records every action, and the weight of wrongdoing accumulates until it demands acknowledgement. Whether through guilt, paranoia, the collapse of trust, or the reckoning of time, those who choose cruelty will face the burden of their choices. Reality is structured in such a way that justice, true, inescapable justice, is woven into its very fabric. A person may outrun the law, may deceive those around them, may even convince themselves that they have avoided accountability. But they cannot escape themselves. They cannot outrun their own conscience, nor can they silence the universal principle that what is sown will, in time, be reaped. Their cruelty will haunt them, not as an external punishment, but as the inevitable outcome of their own actions. Yet there remains a choice. Those who have walked the path of cruelty are not beyond redemption, but redemption is not given, it is earned. It requires an honest confrontation with the past, an acceptance of responsibility, and a commitment to change. It demands integrity, humility, and the courage to rebuild what was broken. This is not the easier path, but it is the only one that leads to true freedom, to meaning, and to a life not haunted by regret. The question is not whether cruelty will come back to those who have wielded it. It will. The question is whether, when that moment comes, they will be prepared to face the truth, or whether they will be crushed beneath the weight of what they have become.